Good afternoon and welcome to Fisher Library's video podcast, Between the Pillars. My name is Liz Rodolfo, librarian here at the Fisher, and today I'm here with Ksenya Kiebuzinski from the Petro, Jacyk Central and Eastern European Resource Center. Hello, Ksenya.
Hi, I'm very glad to be back 1 year later to talk to you about some resources that we have at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library related to refugees.
So you were on our podcast a year ago. Could you talk a little bit about your last visit in case people missed it?
Right, so 1 year ago, I spoke with John Shoesmith for Between the Pillars about Ukraine. This was a few weeks, or maybe a week or two after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and it was in response to a speech that Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, made denying Ukraine a history. And so we pulled material from the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library from the 18th century up to the 20th century, showcasing maps that showed the territory of Ukraine in the 18th century, religious books, political material, and a lovely children's book about how children should kind of be at the duty to save their native home.
So 1 year on, you're back with us, and what kind of material will you be showing us today?
So I wanted to recognize that it's been 9 years actually since the war began in 2014, but it was really with February 24th that the mass kind of bombing of the territory of Ukraine began. And a year on, I wanted to focus on refugees because of the extreme displacement caused by, the relentless shelling of civilian infrastructure, buildings, Russian soldiers occupying territories and then evacuating them, and the terrible conditions there, which prompted about right now 8 million Ukrainians are in Europe, which is a massive amount. If you can imagine, all of Toronto and the greater metropolitan, area, as well as other major cities, basically all of southern Ontario, moving over to, New York State, Michigan. It's mind-boggling. So I wanted to kind of focus on that. By drawing a parallel to a similar situation that happened after World War II. And this being March and Women's Month and International Women's Day coming up next week on March 8th, I kind of wanted to focus on women and children who were refugees after World War II to kind of draw these parallels, because 90% of the refugees in Europe, whether they are in Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, Italy, those are the largest countries, 90% are women and children, 2 million are children.
So you brought some very interesting material for us to look at today. Perhaps we can start. Would you like to talk about the first items that you brought?
Right, so actually the first items are not at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, but these are personal documents that are my grandmother's. She was a refugee together with my grandfather and my mother, who was 5, 6 years old at the time. The first document here that I'm showing is her identity card, and as you can see there, it's bilingual in French and in German because she ended up in the French zone in Austria. So refugees, so Europe, Germany there were French, British American, Soviet zones, and they happened to end up in the French zone. And this card is actually interesting. It has her photograph, fingerprints.
Wow.
It's interesting because it shows here her nationality as Austrian, because when she was born in 1912, that would have been Austria. And then here it shows her nationality as Polish in 1939, because in 1939, where she was born and living, was Poland. But thinking about the refugees now, most of them, if they're under 32, have only known an independent Ukraine, so don't have the same issues. So they have a firm, identity of where they're from. So my grandmother knew she was Ukrainian, but the identity cards, tell you other things. And I think also interesting to show here is, she had a professional, institutrice, so she was a teacher. And then here it indicates that as a refugee, she's a housewife. So she lost kind of her professional identity. And I think many refugees in Europe now, women are, they have professions, but they are employed, although they are grateful for the opportunity to be able to freely work and send children. And then I have like a social service card. So you had to have cards to receive all sorts of services. And then we have here a certificate. Women took courses to kind of get skills. So we have here a certificate of my grandmother completing a 3-month course in cutting and sewing.
Wow.
She was also an incredible knitter. I had thought I might wear one of her knit sweaters.
Yeah.
And she was an embroiderer. And then we have here a Easter card from her brother, who's offering. On the back, there's a little note. I'm assuming that he had already maybe emigrated to the U.S. And there's a card, offering financial support for the family. So I kind of thought it's kind of nice to see the personal connection, and I imagine that people now are carrying similar documents.
Similar documents, yeah. So these are all from your personal archive?
Yeah, and I don't know what I'll do with them at some point to find a safe home. And next, so speaking of, a personal kind of identity cards, the kind of places that refugees lived in between 1945 and 1949, most of by then had either decided to live in Europe, or they immigrated, the greater majority, to Canada or the United States, Australia, some even to South America. But while they were waiting to get documents to immigrate, they lived in barracks such as these. So this particular image is a watercolor from an artist who lived in a displaced person camp in Dillingen, Germany. And he painted scenes of camp life. Most of them are kind of satirical, but this one kind of captures a more, accurate kind of depiction. So these were army barracks that were converted into housing families. So army barracks are meant to have rows of beds for soldiers, and here you had family units all crowded into a barrack with no privacy, improvised rooms with curtains being drawn and things. It was children preferred to be outside most of the time, and if you think about, many of them were in Bavaria or in the Alps, beautiful setting.
Yeah.
So they were able. So in this particular watercolor, at the first store, the artist indicates on the back of this watercolor that he lived here. And then you see a little cross up here, so that was a chapel in service. Apparently this barrack in the background here was a school, where the school was. So this was very typical. But, while it's a lovely watercolor, the conditions inside, as I mentioned, were less than ideal. So we have 55 similar drawings of where he actually shows his rendition of camp life. And in this case, this is captioned Camp Venice because the toilets are overflowing. You can see the latrine kind of over here. You see women floating in what I would assume is a wash basin, and you can kind of see the little rooms. There's a little Mickey Mouse in a boot.
So,
So maybe a child toy that an American soldier
and this person going for a swim in the background.
Yeah, so there are a lot of these kinds of, so anyone who wants to kind of study maybe, I'm thinking about how memes are being used right now. Is it for humor during the war? This is a very similar kind of thing, pre-meme. So if anyone wants to kind of do kind of research on humor and in time of war, this is a wonderful collection. So again, the artist is Leonid Denisenko.
So this would have been created while they were...
Yes, he would have been, in camp, and he eventually immigrated to Australia and donated these drawings to the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. We also have an album of portraits that we purchased recently from Lauren Bear, a vendor that Fisher uses, of portraits of refugees in a camp. So overall, about 200,000 Ukrainians were dispersed in 100 to 110 camps throughout Germany and Austria. Initially, there were about 2 million, but many of them were repatriated, which means they were forced to go back to what was then Soviet Ukraine.
So I think you have some more material related to different aspects of...
Right, so I wanted to talk, so first I wanted to kind of give the personal touch of my connection, connect it to the current situation, give you kind of a picture of what camp life looked like. Now we'll focus on some publications, so I've grouped them into kind of focusing on women and focusing on children. So the first item that I want to show here is, if we can kind of zoom in, it's, well, so women were all sorts after World War II. So this particular book is of Ukrainian women who were interned in Ravensbrook, kind of prisoner of war camp. So this would have been during World War II, not after World War II, and this would have been under Germany. So these would have been women who were involved in Ukrainian nationalist activities. Ravensbrook also housed Jewish women. It housed prisoner of war, women who served in the Red Army. But all in all, there were 130,000 female prisoners, of whom 90,000 never walked out the doors of this camp. 8,000 of them, we believe, were from the territories of Ukraine. If you kind of think Ukraine, as I showed in my grandmother's document, it would have been Polish territory, Soviet Ukrainian territory, but if you look at their places of birth, the Bad Arolsen archive now is digitized, so you can do, and there's a researcher in Canada who has created a database with names and places of birth and things associated with these women who would have ended up after the war in Germany and Austria, separated from their families. Next, I want to kind of shift focus to women as professionals. So as I mentioned, my grandmother was a school teacher, but there were also women who were medical doctors. So this is the next item that I'm going to be showing. Let me see if I can remove these here. And just so there's this book is by Sofia Parfenovich, who was an obstetrician and gynecologist. She was born in Lviv, which is in western Ukraine. I read that she was the first Ukrainian student at the medical faculty of the Lviv University. So that would have been, whether that I would need to verify, but and then she went on to set up her own private practice in this city, but you know, because of the various kind of fluctuations in borders, she eventually had to leave. But she published several books as a displaced person. This particular book is on assistance to the patient, the main tasks of patient care, first aid for acute illnesses, the science of bandages, and it includes 104 drawings. So in this case, we have drawings of how to transport someone who is injured. I'm assuming that, people do get injured in camps. This, are images of how to tie bandages. So bandages for the hand, bandages for the head, for the chest. And it looks like there's actual even photographs. So very detailed drawings. But aside from kind of a first aid, she also published a book in English translation entitled Man and Woman, Sexual Life and Venereal Diseases. Both these books came out in 1946. So you can imagine that, that there was a need for this kind of medical attention. And she actually eventually immigrated to Detroit, not far from here. And she had to get recertified as a physician in the US, of course. So these are challenges that refugees now face.
Yes, this kind of information, would be so important, and especially having it presented with a very visual element to it would be useful for people who perhaps had not as much training, who found themselves having to do this kind of work.
Exactly. And then the next kind of item I want to show will be how women were being taught to adapt to conditions in camps that they needed to be reskilled, perhaps. So moving away from their professional activity to learning trades such as sewing and cutting, like my grandmother did. So this is a beautiful illustrated book by a woman with the surname Ditsko-Melnik, and it was published in 1947 in Ravensbrook and printed by the Ukrainian Women's Alliance in Emigration. And that whole alliance was a network of setting up nurseries, schools, and training women with crafts, perhaps so that they could make money from a skill, but I think it had more practical purposes. For example, sewing clothing for your children, as we're showing here. That this is actually pants for a boy, a full scale, well, not full scale, but a pattern. And then you see the images of kind of the outcomes that could be aspired to make. Or, women didn't want to be not elegant, so, these wonderful kind of Katharine Hepburn-like pajamas.
And these kind of skills would have been extra useful during periods where shortages of fabric and materials.
Right, and so they would repurpose fabrics from uniforms, from, hand-me-downs and things like that. And both my grandmothers were very, craft-oriented. My other grandmother was a seamstress. I remember my mother had a sewing machine, so it got passed on. I became a knitter, but so these skills that came from, this, unfortunately, out of necessity. There was one more item I wanted to show related to women, which was I mentioned this Ukrainian Women's Alliance in Emigration. They published a journal that from 1946 to 1950. And we have an almost complete run at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. And it was not a feminist publication. It was not about women's movements. It was, again, much more practical. It had regular columns on sewing here, or these are the kinds of things on the back cover. It had a beautiful, illustrated cover.
Yeah, gorgeous. Very
Thinking
like
of
textiles.
textile,
Yeah.
embroidery, think of Ukrainian embroidery. But the other kinds of columns you would find here would relate to child rearing, cooking, fashion. There were even, and at some point it changes from this beautiful multi-cover to kind of photographs, so much more of what we think of as contemporary kind of magazines.
Yeah.
It describe activities of the alliance, of the various branches, of women who had already immigrated to Canada. It also had announcements of men looking for wives who were displaced, and my grandmother's sister actually answered such an ad and immigrated to Saskatchewan and raised children in Saskatchewan based on answering an ad that
Wow.
was posted. Yeah, I mean, so here's a kind of an image of what women reaping wheat in Ukraine, kind of the inside. So it's a really wonderful resource for the study of women, not only in displacement, but also in emigration.
Mm.
When it comes to thinking about children, it was really hard to narrow down choices because, I mean, I showed the lovely story last year about a cat whose house is on fire and the cats and chickens put the fire out, and it's beautifully illustrated. And we have so many similar examples of children's literature here, but I thought I would choose maybe 3 items to show to our viewers. And the first one here is a Ukrainian Reader or primer that was published so in emigration in Germany. And we have such similar ones. So this is for grade 1, but we have ones for grade 2, 3, and 4. We also have primers for Ukrainian children in Canada. And this one is so charming because of the illustrations. And the illustrator was Edvard Kozak, who became known in emigration as a caricaturist and satirist. But here, this is a very different style because these are, I think, much more ethnographic, and the typography is amazing. And it was compiled, this reader, by Yevhen Polensky, who was really devoted to creating things for children. And he actually also immigrated. I love this this page opening depicts a father and mother. So a father who kind of looks like a Cossack and a mother in her embroidery and headscarf. So married women would wear. But the way the typography is laid out, I think for students who study book design, and to think these are people who have little resources at their disposal and are creating something beautiful and useful for children, but has enduring value if you look at the layout of the page design.
Would not expect something like this to be so stylish and elegant, and it's just gorgeous.
Yeah.
The amount of care that's gone into the layout.
And now
illustrations.
there's a lot of publishing going on for children who are currently displaced. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to collect in 2022, 2023, new publications that are geared for children, because children are now being educated in Poland or Germany, and they need to have, learned their language. Oh, was that a cat or a dog? A child with cats. Oh, how charming. Who doesn't like cats and eating food? So that's, yeah, it's really, really lovely. I could spend the whole day looking at that. I think really stunning next item. So this book is published by a woman author, Natalia Zabila. She was actually not displaced. She remained in Ukraine, but she was a children's writer in Ukraine, and she had at one point been in Lviv in western Ukraine in the 1940, 41, 42, 43. And the publisher of this is Nashim Dityam, which means our children, and they were based there. And I believe the publisher took a lot of publishing files with him into emigration as a displaced person. So the book that I showed last year was also by the same publisher, but the artists remained in Ukraine. So I suspect these were books planned to come out in Western Ukraine, but because of displacement. So we're lucky that they survived. But this book, I'm going to actually, if we can flip through the pages of this, it's about a bus that it drives around in a busy city in Kiev, and it gets tired of transporting people and wants to break free. So it heads out of the garage here. It's in the garage, and it's making its kind of breakaway. And it goes into the countryside, and it scares a bunch of animals in a forest with its lights and noise. Here we see the animals, but it runs out of gas. So the animals are no longer frightened by this thing, and they're curious, and they enter into the bus, and they kind of take over the bus. The fox gets behind the driving wheel. Other animals entered. This next one has a lovely scene where the words here say, "Don't spit or litter," and you see a squirrel cracking nuts and littering the bus, a pigeon, a rabbit.
I'm sure the mouse is making a mess as well.
A mouse.
Yeah.
The bus is now not happy that it decided to do what it did, and an airplane flies by, and the bus asks for help, and it shares gasoline with the bus. I don't know how that happens technologically, and the bus makes it back to the city and is happy to carry around people again. But it's the way it's illustrated, those reds, oh, there you see, it's back doing what buses are supposed to do. It's really beautiful. So published, Regensburg and Munich in 1946 by the publisher Our Children, and it was a very prolific publisher. And I want to kind of close with two items. They may not be as visually interesting, but I feel that I'm going to show you two poems. Because I think, when you think about children then and after World War II and children now, how do you kind of keep their ties to the country from which they are displaced? So on the left, we have a poem called Kiev, and it was published in a little kind of textbook, which was called Little Schoolboy, Shkolarik. It came out from beginning in 1945. We only have a single issue of this, and the single issue has this cover poem about the city of Kiev. And basically the poem tells you about how the wind blows and shakes flowers and carries my thoughts to the glorious city of Kiev. So presumably the thoughts are being carried because this child is away. And he is a strong-chested knight, and Kiev stands above the Dnieper River. I loved him, so it's kind of this paternalistic image of Kiev as the father city of Ukraine. I loved him and will still love him. And I love the city abroad. Because I know only one thing: Kiev is the father of Ukraine, and I am its son. So it is really beautiful. And then the poem on the left is in a children's book called Dear Children, and the author here has a poem called Ukraine. So this was published in 1947. The opening poem talks about Ukraine as a mother figure. So we have Kiev as the father city, Ukraine as the mother, and we are her children. We learn to love everything from an early age. We learn from other people, meaning, people from other countries, other customs. Nature is different everywhere. There are forests, villages, and fields all over the world, but ours is native to us and therefore more beautiful. And everything in the world, all around there are birds, many who sing, but there is no nightingale like the one that sings at night in their homeland. And you know what the nightingale sings? It grabs our hearts that our glorious Ukraine is our native mother, rich in rivers, steppes, and songs. So the children who are in the displaced person camps are being not indoctrinated, but maybe in some ways they are the future patriots of Ukraine. They are going to be the first generation. Many of them came from throughout Ukraine. And this was the first time they were being mixed together because Ukraine was split up into different countries. So I thought those words were, for me personally, very moving to think about given the current circumstances.
Well, thank you for showing us all of this wonderful material. So most of it is available at the Fisher Library. I think the only things you showed that were not were your family documents, right?
Right, and I should say that most of the material comes from the John Luchkiw collection of displaced person publications, and that collection was given to the Thomas Fisher Library in the early 1980s, and it's about 1,800 pamphlets, books, periodicals. So it is an incredibly rich resource for studying many different aspects of refugee life, from literature to women to children to political organizations, religious organizations, and they're all available for anyone with an interest who wants to come to the Fisher Library and come and look at them.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Ksenya. It was so nice to have you back here.
And thank you, Liz. It was a pleasure to be back, but it's unfortunate circumstances. But I think it's really interesting to use books as a way to educate people and to draw comparisons. So the Thomas Fisher Library is perfect for this kind of work.
Thanks again, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll see you shortly with another episode of Between the Pillars, looking at more collections at the Fisher Library.